The following passage is taken from my new publication, Reflections on the 2020 Scamdemic. Please see the link in the description for more information. The politics, aesthetics, and semiotics of masking never evoked much of a response from anyone prior to 2020. Yet, during that year and afterwards, it became clear that masks only masqueraded as a matter of quote-unquote public health. Instead, donning a mask in many cases was essentially a signifier of ideological assent to prevailing dogma, rather than a legitimate response to an ostensible health crisis. That is to say, it was, more or less, but usually more, sheer political theater. In many cases, masking was an act of self-aware, straight-up, pedal-to-the-metal virtue signaling, an effort to demonstrate to the world that you are most assuredly, quote, on the right side of history. For the vast majority, however, masking was done more out of a dutiful sense that, for whatever given reason, it simply ought to be done. For these latter, far greater in number, there was no especial haughtiness about face covering as signifying social superiority, nor was there particular hostility towards those few who, like me, remained stubbornly maskless in their midst. Such people as these simply donned their face coverings, out of what they vaguely took to be obligation. It's the rules. The same way a private school student might be conscientious about making sure his or her uniform were being worn correctly, in a manner that will avoid getting a demerit or detention from a zealous hall-monitoring administrator. During the masking and mass quarantining era of 2020, of course, the hall-monitoring types were often self-selected, rather than being appointed. Some indeed counted themselves virtuous for snitching if they noticed that a neighbor had too many friends or family members at his house. This sort of person wouldn't hesitate to inform the authorities to break up all of this dangerous togetherness and fearful human proximity going on nearby. Others would yell at you directly if your mask had horrors, slipped to the point of being slightly under the roof of your nose, feeling absolutely no shame about their obstreperous sanctimony. People such as these were easy enough to dismiss as embittered little petty tyrants, getting off on the power they were allowed to wield in causing misery to others. They were not that much different, however, from the mayors, governors, and other holders of office who seemed eager to impose as many draconian and unconstitutional restrictions on freedoms to assemble or to enjoy normal or healthy activities, such as those who mandated that outdoor hiking be banned, that skate parks be covered with sand, that children's playground areas be covered with crime scene-esque do not enter tape, that outdoor basketball and tennis courts be boarded up. Those who mandated such insane measures were on the same sort of power trip as the neighborhood snitches. They simply had more power. All the while, as we saw over and over again, these folk largely exempted themselves and their friends from that which they imposed on the riffraff and the hoi polloi whom they presumed to tyrannize. Recall that when word spread that British PM Boris Johnson and his cronies were partying hardy while imposing the strictest of lockdowns on the UK population, the jig was officially up, not just in Great Britain, but nearly everywhere. Some of the mask nags, of course, were forced to enforce the masquerade, and they would lay claim to "just doing my job" excuses. If they exhibited snippy, obnoxiously censorious behavior of assumed officious tones with customers, and the target of their ire responded with anything other than groveling obeisance, the corporate-controlled media automatically counted them as victims of rude and unruly miscreants. All through 2020 and into 2021, for example, news outlets ran constant stories about how presumably loutish airline passengers were, supposedly abusing flight attendants in a most reprehensible manner, deserving of unrelenting censure and vituperative reprobation. Such stories ran unabated, and, I couldn't help but notice, never with an eye towards understanding the ostensibly churlish passenger's perspective. These, quote, news stories were actually stealth editorials, and the opinion which the writer invariably expressed was always some variation on the theme. People are suddenly behaving insufferably on airplanes, causing the noble and highly responsible and deeply admirable airline staff members no end of trouble. I flew a couple of times during this period, and clearly recall incidents in which a passenger was spoken to in a quite disrespectful manner because his mask wasn't securely covering all of his airspace apertures. On the occasions I witnessed, the accidentally non-mask compliant passenger in question didn't respond at all with any sort of sass or backtalk, though I wouldn't have blamed him at all if he'd chosen to be a bit less chastened and apologetic in his reply. I also distinctly recall standing in the Atlanta airport, waiting to board my plane, and having to hear a bitchily effeminate young African-American steward scold us in the manner of a fourth-grade teacher lecturing her naughty class. Now, I don't want to see nobody with the mask on the chins. It's called a face mask, not a chin mask, okay? Yes, that actually happened. Even if I hadn't encountered incidents like these personally, I would have regarded the media campaign repeatedly inveighing against supposedly unmannerly airline passengers, never given any context, with great suspicion. Who, after all, would actually trust the media, or the government, or the pharma medical establishment to tell the truth at this juncture? Still, it is occasionally fascinating to observe the ways in which they attempt to mold our behavior and manage our reactions to events, whether through overt shaming or ingratiating cajolement or manufactured sympathy. With surgical masks, it is instructive to note that, excluding their legitimate use in the operating room environment, they have a history of being put to use as torture tools. Over a decade ago, long before 2020 in its kaleidoscope of horrors, inmates at Guantanamo Bay were photographed in, quote, stress positions, forced to sit on their knees with their hands bound behind their backs and masks strapped to their faces. The very same type of airway smothering muzzles that the general public was compelled to fasten to their faces during the lockdown era. I won't insult your intelligence, dear reader, but rather leave you to connect the dots. Remember that Guantanamo Bay is a prison, and lockdown is a term used by prison wardens with regard to people whom they are holding captive and whose liberties they are actively and intentionally suppressing. One needn't draw a diagram to comprehend the ominous parallels.